teach her to shut up. I did not scream. I did not lunge across the living room to strangle him, even though every primal instinct in my aging body screamed for blood. I simply stepped between them, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I had not used in 15 years. They had absolutely no idea what I had just set in motion. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and the financial empire my son-in-law had built with my money burned to the ground. But to understand why the police were not the ones waiting on the other side of that door, I have to take you back 4 months. Back to the day I realized I had financed a monster. If you are listening to this, take a deep breath. Sometimes the people who claim to love your family are the exact ones trying to destroy it from the inside out. My name is William Stanton, but everyone in Chicago just calls me Bill. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire adult life building a commercial logistics company from a single rusted delivery truck into a massive regional empire. I spent 40 years negotiating with ruthless union bosses, corporate sharks, and corrupt politicians. You do not survive in that industry without learning how to read people. I know how to spot a bad deal. I know how to spot a liar. And I certainly know how to spot a predator. But when it came to my only daughter, Natalie, I let my guard down. I wanted nothing more than for her to be happy and secure. So when she married Derek Thorne, a charismatic, fast-talking guy running a boutique investment firm, I wanted to set them up for success. I gave them a $2 million seed gift to buy their dream home in the upscale suburbs. I thought I was securing her future. I did not know I was funding her prison. It all started on Labor Day weekend. The weather in Chicago was brutal that afternoon, pushing 90 degrees with that heavy, suffocating humidity that makes it hard to breathe. Derek was hosting a massive end-of-summer barbecue at his $5 million estate. The sprawling backyard was overflowing with wealthy tech investors, catered gourmet food, and endless bottles of expensive champagne. It looked like a scene straight out of a luxury magazine. I was standing near the edge of the stone patio, holding a glass of iced tea, quietly observing the crowd. That is when I saw my daughter. Natalie was standing near the outdoor kitchen island, away from the main cluster of guests. Despite the sweltering heat, she was wearing a long-sleeved, high-necked silk blouse. It struck me as incredibly odd. Everyone else was in sundresses and short sleeves, wiping sweat from their foreheads, yet my daughter was covered from her neck to her wrists. Natalie was always fashion-conscious, but she was never impractical. I decided to walk over and say hello. Derek was standing right next to her, holding a bottle of red wine, laughing loudly at a joke one of his business partners had just made. He looked like the king of the world, soaking up the admiration of everyone around him. As I approached them, Derek abruptly reached across Natalie to grab a clean wine glass from the rack, positioned just behind her. It was a fast, sudden movement. Nothing aggressive, just a quick reach. What happened next lasted only a fraction of a second, but it is burned into my memory forever. Natalie violently flinched. She shrank back, raising her right shoulder defensively toward her face, and her eyes went wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. She braced her body as if she were about to sustain a heavy impact. It was the involuntary, deeply ingrained reflex of someone expecting to be hit. Derek did not even notice. He simply grabbed the crystal glass, poured his wine, and turned his attention back to his wealthy guests, laughing as if nothing had happened. But I noticed. I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. My daughter was a former state champion gymnast. She used to do backflips on a 4-inch balance beam without breaking a single sweat. She possessed nerves of steel and perfect spatial awareness. She was never jumpy. She was never easily startled. That flinch was not a simple accident. That flinch was pure, conditioned physical fear. I waited until Derek walked away to mingle with another group of investors. Once we were alone, I stepped up beside my daughter. I forced my muscles to relax and kept my voice light, casual, trying desperately not to spook her any further. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" "You seem a little jumpy today," I asked carefully, watching her face for any micro-expressions. Natalie quickly turned to me and forced a laugh. It was a hollow, brittle sound that completely failed to reach her eyes. Oh, I took a bad spill in Pilates this morning, Dad. I am just a little sore. You know how clumsy I am lately. I am always tripping over my own feet. I stared at her. Clumsy. The girl who practically lived in a gymnastics gym for 15 years was suddenly clumsy. I wanted to grab her hands, roll up those silk sleeves, and demand the truth. But before I could press the issue or ask another question, Derek appeared out of nowhere. He materialized right behind her, sliding his arm securely around her waist, pulling her tight against his chest. I noticed instantly how her posture went completely rigid. She froze like a deer caught in the headlights. "Are you telling your dad about your little accident, Nat?" Derek asked, his voice dripping with a synthetic, performative sweetness. He looked directly at me, flashing that perfect, expensive white smile. "She took a nasty fall this morning at the gym, Bill. I told her she really needs to be more careful. In fact, I just bought her a little surprise to cheer her up. A brand new Porsche Cayenne SUV. It is being delivered next week. I figure a bigger, safer car will make sure my clumsy wife stays safe on the road." Natalie nodded quickly, her eyes glued firmly to the granite countertop, refusing to meet my gaze. "Yes, he is too good to me. I am so spoiled. I do not deserve it." I looked at them closely. I smiled. I raised my iced tea and toasted them, playing the role of the proud, clueless, elderly father-in-law to absolute perfection. I told them how wonderful that was, how generous Derek was being, and how incredibly lucky they were. But internally, the alarm bells were deafening. I spent 40 years negotiating with the most dangerous men in Chicago. I knew exactly what a hostage situation looked like when I saw one. I was preparing for a war. 2 weeks passed since that sweltering Labor Day barbecue, but the image of my daughter flinching away from her husband played on a continuous, agonizing loop in my mind. I could not sleep. I could not focus on my retirement hobbies. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Natalie raising her shoulder, bracing for an impact that she had clearly been conditioned to expect. I needed to know more. I needed to see Derek Thorne in his natural habitat, stripped of his dutiful husband routine. I needed to see how he operated when he was not performing for a backyard full of wealthy guests. I decided to drop by his office unannounced. I knew that arriving empty-handed would raise suspicion, so I stopped at a high-end liquor store and purchased a bottle of Macallan 25-year-old single malt scotch. It was the perfect Trojan horse for a father-in-law wanting to simply congratulate his son-in-law on a recent successful quarter. Thorne Capital was located in a sleek, modern high-rise in the heart of downtown Chicago. Stepping off the elevator onto the 40th floor, I was immediately struck by the sheer opulence. It did not look like a traditional investment firm. It resembled a playground built with someone else's money. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered panoramic views of the city skyline. Abstract art pieces hung on the pristine walls. The employees were mostly young, sharply dressed, and moving with a frantic, nervous energy. They looked less like financial analysts and more like salespeople desperately trying to meet a quota. I walked up to the main reception desk. The area was temporarily deserted. The receptionist had likely stepped away, leaving her sleek workstation unattended. I stood there holding my expensive bottle of scotch, waiting patiently. That is when my eyes drifted down to the surface of the desk. Lying open next to a neat stack of mail was a thick manila folder. The glossy logo of a local Porsche dealership was printed on the top page. It was the insurance and registration paperwork for the new Cayenne SUV Derek had promised Natalie at the barbecue, the gift that was supposed to make up for her clumsy accident. My curiosity got the better of me. I am a businessman. I have spent my entire life reading contracts, analyzing ledgers, and looking for hidden clauses. I leaned forward slightly, adjusting my glasses, and let my eyes scan the fine print on the open document. I expected to see my daughter's name listed under the ownership section. I expected to see her listed as the primary policyholder. Instead, I saw a corporate entity. The vehicle was registered exclusively to Thorne Holdings, LLC. I frowned, my eyes darting across the lines of text. I recognized the structure immediately. It was a corporate lease agreement completely controlled by a shell company. Natalie had absolutely no equity in the vehicle. She had no legal ownership. Her name was only listed as an authorized secondary driver. In the eyes of the law, that expensive gift did not belong to her at all. It was a company asset. It could be repossessed, sold, or taken away from her at a moment's notice by the managing director of the LLC. And the sole managing director clearly printed at the bottom of the page was Derek Thorne. Before I could process the full implication of what I was reading, a voice boomed across the lobby. "Bill." What a fantastic surprise. I straightened up immediately and turned around. Derek was striding out of his corner office, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His charismatic smile was plastered perfectly across his face, but I did not miss the brief flash of annoyance in his eyes when he realized where I was standing. He had seen me looking at the desk. He knew exactly what was inside that open folder. Derek closed the distance between us, extending a hand to shake mine. I took it, matching his firm grip, and offered him my warmest, most oblivious smile. "Derek," I said smoothly, "I hope I am not interrupting your day. I was in the neighborhood having lunch with an old colleague and thought I would drop this off." I handed him the wooden box containing the Macallan. "Just a little something to celebrate your recent expansion." Derek took the box, his eyes lighting up with genuine appreciation for the expensive liquor. "Bill, you really did not have to do this. This is incredibly generous of you. Come on back to my office, let us have a drink." As he turned to lead the way, he casually reached out and flipped the manila folder closed, sliding it seamlessly toward the edge of the desk. I let out a soft, admiring chuckle, playing my part. I could not help but notice the Porsche logo on that file, I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. Getting the paperwork finalized for Natalie's new car, Derek did not miss a beat. He turned back to me, his smile never faltering. His demeanor was smooth, polished, and entirely convincing. "Yes, absolutely. We are taking delivery on Friday. She is going to be absolutely thrilled." I noticed it was registered to an LLC, I remarked, casually raising an eyebrow. "A business expense?" Derek nodded enthusiastically, stepping closer with the confidential air of a man sharing a brilliant strategy. "Tax optimization, Bill. You know how it is in this bracket. My certified public accountant strongly advised me to place the vehicle inside a holding company. It protects Natalie's personal assets from any potential corporate liability. If anyone ever tries to sue the firm, her car is completely shielded. Plus, the depreciation write-off is fantastic. It is just smart business." To a standard father-in-law who did not understand the intricate workings of corporate finance, it would have sounded like the perfect, responsible explanation. It sounded like the actions of a caring, intelligent husband looking out for his family's best interests. But I was not a layman. I was a man who had built a logistics empire from a single truck. I knew every trick, every loophole, and every dirty tactic in the corporate playbook. Wolves recognize wolves. You do not hide a supposed gift to your wife inside a corporate shell to protect her. You hide it to control her. You structure it so that if a divorce ever happens, she walks away with absolutely nothing. You do it to ensure she remains entirely financially dependent on you. Derek was not protecting my daughter. He was isolating her. He was building a gilded cage, making sure that every piece of luxury she enjoyed was tethered strictly to his permission. If she ever stepped out of line, he could take the car, the credit cards, and the money away with a single phone call. I looked at the man standing in front of me. I looked at his expensive suit, his perfect hair, and his charming, deceptive smile. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. The flinch at the barbecue was not an isolated incident. It was the physical symptom of a much deeper, insidious disease. My daughter was trapped. "That is brilliant, Derek," I said, forcing a look of admiration onto my face. "You really know how to take care of her. I am glad she has a husband who is looking out for her future." Derek beamed, his ego thoroughly stroked. "I try my best, Bill. She means everything to me." We spent the next 20 minutes in his office chatting about the market, sipping the expensive scotch, and playing our respective roles. I nodded at his stories, laughed at his jokes, and praised his business acumen. But beneath my polite exterior, the gut feeling I had experienced at the barbecue had solidified into absolute dread. When I finally left his office and stepped into the elevator, the heavy silence pressed against my chest. My hands, which had been perfectly steady during the entire interaction, began to tremble slightly. I had funded this man. I had given him the $2 million seed money that allowed him to project this image of wealth and success. I had paved the way for him to trap my own flesh and blood. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. I had been foolish. I had been blinded by my desire to see Natalie happy. But that blindness was gone now. The blinders had been ripped away, leaving only a cold, calculating clarity. Derek Thorne thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he had completely fooled the retired logistics boss. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the first thread of his unraveling. I walked out of the building and into the bustling Chicago streets. The crisp air hit my face, clearing my mind. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at my contacts. I could not confront Derek directly. If I did, he would immediately tighten his grip on Natalie. He would spin a web of lies, make me look like a paranoid fool, and punish her behind closed doors. No, I had to be so much smarter. I had to be utterly ruthless. I had to dismantle his entire life from the shadows piece by piece until he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The war had begun, and I would ensure he lost everything. The following Sunday, I drove over for our traditional family dinner. I needed to keep up appearances, playing the role of the very doting father who had no idea what was brewing beneath the surface. Pulling up to their sprawling estate, it now looked like a fortress designed to keep my daughter trapped inside. I parked my car, forcing my face into an unsuspecting smile. Natalie opened the door. She looked exhausted, her smile strained, but she hugged me tightly. I stepped into the grand foyer. I walked into the main living area expecting to find Derek. Instead, I found the one person who disgusted me almost as much as Derek himself, his older brother, Trent. Trent Thorne possessed all of Derek's arrogance but none of his charm. He had no discernible skills and no real purpose. Yet he paraded around Thorne Capital with a manufactured title. In reality, he was a professional leech acting as Derek's personal enforcer. Trent was currently lounging on the custom leather sofa, his expensive shoes propped up carelessly on the glass coffee table. He did not even bother to stand up when I entered. He just offered a lazy wave, his eyes glued to the massive television screen. I took a seat in a velvet armchair opposite him. Natalie hovered near the doorway, nervously twisting her wedding ring, asking if we needed anything. Trent did not even look at her. He kept his eyes on the television, raised his right hand in the air, and snapped his fingers loudly. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the quiet room like a whip. "Fetch me a scotch," Nat Trent ordered, his tone dripping with absolute disdain and casual cruelty. "And make it quick. Do not make me remind you of the house rules again." I froze. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy. I watched my daughter, a woman who used to fiercely debate corporate strategy at my dinner table, completely shrink into herself. She did not argue. She did not tell him to get it himself. She simply lowered her eyes to the floor, her shoulders slumping in defeat, and murmured a quiet apology before turning toward the wet bar. The sheer obedience in her posture made my blood boil. It was not just disrespect. It was a deeply ingrained system of subjugation. Trent was exercising authority that he had clearly been permitted to wield over her in her own home. The fact that a worthless freeloader like Trent felt comfortable treating my highly educated daughter like an indentured servant told me everything I needed to know about what happened behind closed doors. I stood up slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. In my experience, the quietest men in the room are always the most dangerous. I walked over to the coffee table, reached out, and firmly shoved Trent's expensive shoes off the glass. His feet hit the floor with a heavy thud. Trent startled, looking away from the television, his face twisting into a scowl of indignation. "Excuse me," Trent sputtered, puffing out his chest. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from his. My voice dropped a full octave, settling into a cold, menacing gravel. "You will never speak to my daughter that way again," I said slowly, enunciating every syllable. "You will not snap your fingers at her like she is a dog, and you will certainly not disrespect her in the house that my money paid for. Do you understand me, Trent, or do I need to explain the house rules to you outside?" Trent swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk melting off his face as he pressed his back into the sofa cushions. He opened his mouth to formulate a response, but before he could speak, the heavy oak doors of the study swung open. Derek strolled into the room holding 2 crystal glasses of bourbon, wearing a perfectly tailored casual sweater. He instantly sensed the hostility in the air. His eyes darted from my rigid posture to his brother's pale face and then to Natalie, who was trembling slightly near the bar. Derek immediately deployed his signature charm, letting out a booming, entirely fake laugh that echoed through the tense living room. "Whoa, hold on there, boys." Derek chuckled, stepping smoothly between us and handing me a glass of bourbon. "Let us lower the temperature a bit. It is just sibling banter, Bill. You know how Trent gets when his team is losing. He means no harm." "Right, Trent." Trent quickly nodded, rubbing the back of his neck and forcing an awkward, nervous chuckle. "Yeah, of course, Bill. I was just joking around." "I am sorry, Nat." I took the glass from Derek, my eyes never leaving his face. I did not return his smile. "I am glad we are all on the same page, Derek," I said evenly, "because I do not find humor in disrespect." Derek's smile remained fixed, but the warmth completely vanished from his eyes. He turned his head slightly toward Natalie. It was a microscopic movement, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. He shot her a cold, dead, terrifying glare. It was a look of pure, unadulterated warning, a silent promise of punishment to come once the guests had gone. Natalie instantly averted her gaze, shrinking back against the counter, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was terrified of him. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in psychological torture. We sat around the grand dining table, making polite conversation and pretending that the foundation of their marriage was not rotting from the inside out. I played my part. I asked Derek about his latest acquisitions and ignored the way Trent chewed his food with smug satisfaction. I even managed to smile when Derek casually draped his arm over Natalie's chair for my benefit. But every time I looked at my daughter, my heart completely shattered a little more. She was a hostage wearing a diamond ring trapped in a gilded cage. I realized in that dining room that I could not simply pull her out. If I demanded she leave with me right then, he would manipulate the situation. He would twist the narrative, isolate her further, and likely unleash his physical rage on her the moment I left. He had established a culture of absolute fear, ensuring she felt completely helpless. I had to dismantle his power completely. I had to strip away his wealth and his sense of invincibility before I could safely extract her. When dinner concluded, I hugged Natalie goodbye at the front door. I held her a fraction of a second longer, silently promising her that this nightmare would end soon. I shook Derek's hand, thanked him, and walked out to my car. The crisp night air filled my lungs as I started the engine. As I drove away from the sprawling estate, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror, the silent declaration of war solidified in my mind. Direct confrontation was a fool's errand. It was time to go to war quietly. It was time to unleash a storm he could not see coming. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the Chicago skyline. I did not go to my usual country club, and I certainly did not contact the corporate legal team that handled my logistics empire. Corporate lawyers are excellent at drawing up contracts and keeping you out of civil court, but they operate strictly within the sterile boundaries of the law. They lack the necessary imagination for what I was about to do. I needed someone who understood how to operate in the mud. I needed a ghost. I drove my car to the far south side of the city, pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a dilapidated neon-lit diner that looked like it had not been renovated since the 1980s. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried grease. I walked through the double glass doors, the bell jingling overhead, and scanned the worn leather booths. Sitting in the very back, obscured by the shadows and a thick cloud of steam rising from his mug, was Mitchell Carter. Mitchell was not a lawyer you would ever find listed in a glossy downtown directory. He was a crisis manager, a fixer. During the vicious logistics union wars of the 1990s, when my trucks were being vandalized and my drivers were being threatened by organized thugs, Mitchell was the man I called to level the playing field. He was brilliant, utterly ruthless, and completely invisible to the public eye. He operated a boutique firm of former intelligence officers, forensic accountants, and private investigators who specialized in tearing apart the lives of powerful men. As I slid into the booth across from him, he did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply took a slow sip of his black coffee and looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "You look terrible, Bill," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You should be enjoying your retirement on a golf course. Instead, you are sitting in a grease trap at 6 a.m. Who do we need to bury?" I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and placed a completely blank check on the sticky laminate table between us. I slid it across to him. Mitchell glanced down at the paper, then back up at my face. "I want you to tear Derek Thorne's life apart," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. "I want to know where every single penny of Thorne Capital comes from. I want to know who he owes money to, what shell companies he is hiding, and exactly what kind of filth he is swimming in. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. Hack his servers, shadow his brother, and dig through his offshore accounts. I want a complete financial autopsy of his entire existence." Mitchell did not touch the check immediately. He leaned back in his vinyl seat, studying the absolute conviction in my eyes. "Derek Thorne," he mused softly. "Your golden boy son-in-law. The flashy investment guru. What did he do to earn a blank check bounty from the man who funded him?" "He put his hands on my daughter," I replied, the words tasting like poison on my tongue. "He isolated her, trapped her in a corporate shell game, and let his parasitic brother treat her like a dog. He thinks he is untouchable because he uses my money to project power. I need you to strip that power away. I need to know his vulnerabilities before I strike, because when I finally bring the hammer down, I cannot leave him with a single avenue of escape." Mitchell finally reached out and picked up the blank check. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The dynamic of the conversation shifted instantly. The casual air vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a man who had just been given the green light to hunt. "Give me 72 hours to assemble the team," Mitchell said. "We will start by mirroring his corporate servers and pulling the public tax filings of every limited liability company registered to his address. If he is hiding assets, we will find the paper trail. But you need to understand something, Bill. If Thorne is manipulating funds on the scale you suspect, we might stumble into territory that goes far beyond a simple domestic dispute. Men who play shell games with luxury cars usually play shell games with investor capital. If we pull the wrong thread, we might uncover a federal crime. Are you prepared for the collateral damage? What if your daughter's name is legally tied to his fraudulent activities?" I felt a cold chill wash over me at the thought, but my resolve did not waver. "That is exactly why I came to you, instead of the authorities," I answered. "I need to control the flow of information. If she is implicated on paper, we need to extract her cleanly before the house of cards collapses. I do not care if Thorne burns. In fact, I welcome it. But Natalie must remain completely untouched. You find the leverage, Mitchell. You build the weapon. I will be the one who decides exactly when and how to pull the trigger." Mitchell nodded slowly, a dark smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Consider it done," he said. The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. I walked out of the diner and drove back into the city, leaving Mitchell to deploy his network of ghosts. The hardest part of the entire operation was about to begin. The waiting game. I could not storm into Derek's office and demand answers. I could not rescue Natalie today. For the next few weeks, I had to completely suppress my towering rage. I had to continue playing the role of the oblivious, wealthy father-in-law. I had to smile at family dinners, shake Derek's hand, and listen to Trent's obnoxious banter without showing a single fracture in my friendly facade. It was a psychological torment unlike anything I had ever experienced in my business career. Every time I looked at my daughter's nervous posture, every time I saw her check Derek's expression before speaking, I had to forcefully swallow the bile rising in my throat. I had to remind myself that true power is patient. While I played the fool in the daylight, Mitchell's black hat accountants were quietly slipping into the digital shadows of Thorn Capital. They were probing firewalls, tracking offshore wire transfers, and unmasking the hidden corporate entities Derek believed were untraceable. They worked in absolute silence, assembling a massive puzzle of corruption that would soon provide me with the exact ammunition I desperately needed. I was prepared to wait as long as it took to ensure his total destruction. The trap was being set with meticulous precision. Derek thought he had permanently secured his empire by manipulating a defenseless woman. He thought his wealth made him a god among men. He was entirely oblivious to the reality that an invisible noose was currently being slipped tightly around his neck. November arrived, bringing with it the bitter, biting winds that swept off Lake Michigan. It also brought Thanksgiving, a holiday that usually filled my home with warmth, laughter, and the rich scents of roasting turkey. This year, I was preparing to host a monster. I spent the morning meticulously preparing the house, ensuring every silver piece was polished. I had to maintain the illusion of a welcoming patriarch. When the doorbell finally rang at 3 in the afternoon, I took a deep breath, plastered a jovial smile onto my face, and opened the door. Derek stood on the porch wearing a tailored cashmere coat, holding expensive vintage wine. Trent was right behind him, looking predictably bored. And then there was Natalie. She stepped into the foyer, bringing a rush of cold air with her. I reached out to take her coat, pulling her into a warm embrace. As I hugged her, I felt the rigid tension in her shoulders. She was stiff, holding her breath just a fraction of a second longer than normal. But it was not until we moved into the dining room, bathed in the unforgiving glow of the crystal chandelier, that I saw it. Natalie was wearing an unusual amount of makeup. Her foundation was layered thickly across her forehead and temples. She turned her head slightly to hang her purse on the back of a chair. The movement caught the light perfectly. Just below her hairline, obscured from a casual glance but glaringly obvious to a father, was the unmistakable yellowish-purple edge of a fading bruise. My heart plummeted. It was definitely not a small blemish. The crescent shape suggested a blunt, forceful impact. The thick concealer was doing its best to hide the trauma, but the raw, discolored skin betrayed the violent truth. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. A primitive anger surged through my veins, screaming at me to drag Derek out onto the driveway and beat him. But I forced my hands to relax. I forced my breathing to remain steady. I knew that if I confronted him right then, Natalie would pay the ultimate price the moment they returned to their isolated suburban fortress. I had to swallow the poison. I had to smile. We sat at the mahogany dining table. I began carving the turkey, engaging in trivial conversation about market trends. Derek was in rare form, holding court with his magnetic charm. He was an exceptional performer, effortlessly dominating the room with a practiced confidence. I handed him a plate piled high with food. As he took it, he smoothly steered the conversation toward Natalie, seizing control of the narrative before I could even formulate a private question. "Bill, I have a confession to make," Derek said, letting out a warm, self-deprecating chuckle that echoed around the room. He reached over and gently took Natalie's hand, his thumb rubbing her knuckles in a display of manufactured affection. "I am officially the worst doubles partner in the history of the Chicago Racquet Club. I almost took my beautiful wife's head off on Tuesday. I paused, setting the carving knife down on the silver platter. Oh, really? I asked, maintaining a perfectly neutral, amused tone. What happened? Derek shook his head, looking deeply embarrassed. We were playing a mixed doubles match against one of my senior partners. I went for a wild backhand near the net, completely misjudged the distance and the frame of my racket, caught Natalie right near the temple. He looked at her with wide, apologetic eyes. She went down hard. I have never been so terrified in my life. I felt absolutely terrible. Trent, sitting across the table with his mouth full of potatoes, let out a snort. It was hilarious, Bill. You should have seen Derek's face. He looked like he had just crashed his sports car. He was hovering over her like a panicked mother hen. I slowly looked at my daughter. I waited for her to speak, praying for a subtle cry for help. Instead, Natalie nodded vigorously, her voice pitching up a full octave in an overly eager, conditioned agreement. It was totally my fault, Dad, she insisted, offering a bright, strained smile. I stepped right into his swing path. I should have been paying closer attention to the ball. Derek was so sweet about it. He iced it for hours and would not let me do any chores for 2 days. It is just a silly bruise. It looks way worse than it actually is. I looked at the thick layer of foundation covering her temple. I looked at the way her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her water glass. A tennis racket does not leave a bruise that requires an industrial amount of concealer, and a minor sports injury does not cause a woman to vigorously defend the man who accidentally hit her. She was reciting a script. Derek had rehearsed this lie with her, ensuring that if I noticed the mark, the explanation would be delivered flawlessly and backed by her absolute submission. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Derek had brought my battered daughter into my own home, sat at my dinner table, and mocked her pain by turning it into a charming, self-deprecating anecdote. He was daring me to question him. He was flaunting his control. I grabbed the heavy crystal decanter of red wine. I walked around the table, stopping directly behind Derek's chair. I let out a hearty laugh, blending into their fabricated reality. Well, Derek, I said cheerfully, as I poured the dark crimson liquid into his glass. You better stick to financial portfolios and leave the tennis swings to the professionals. We cannot have you damaging my daughter. Derek laughed loudly, raising his glass to clink against the decanter. You have my word, Bill. I will be much more careful with her from now on. I smiled down at him, my face a mask of genial fatherly warmth. Inside, I was not laughing. Inside, a tribunal had convened, the verdict had been reached, and the sentence had been passed. Derek Thorne was a dead man walking. The financial ruin I had ordered Mitchell to orchestrate was no longer just about teaching an arrogant son-in-law a lesson about respect. It was not a simple extraction of assets. It had become a desperate, time-sensitive rescue mission. My daughter was in immediate physical danger. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, calmly slicing into my turkey, chewing my food, while Trent babbled about a recent football game. I looked at Natalie silently, promising her that this would be the last holiday she ever spent covering up a bruise. I needed Mitchell to break their servers. I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to trap Derek so completely that he would never be able to raise a hand to another human being again. The waiting game had officially ended. It was time to load the weapon. The morning after Thanksgiving, I drove to meet with Mitchell. The time for passive observation was over. I walked into his dimly lit office, taking a seat across from his steel desk. Mitchell was staring at his computer monitors, his expression grim. I asked him for an immediate update. Instead of good news, Mitchell sighed heavily. He told me they had hit an impenetrable digital wall. Thorne Capital was not using standard corporate security. Derek had locked his private ledgers behind a sophisticated military-grade encryption firewall. Mitchell explained that his accountants could not brute force their way into the server system without triggering an automated security alarm that would wipe the drives. The digital perimeter was completely sealed. If we wanted to see the real numbers and the hidden debts, we desperately needed physical proximity. Mitchell stated plainly that we needed a hardware bridge placed directly inside Derek's private executive suite, as close to his personal router as possible. I sat in silence processing the immense logistical nightmare. Derek's downtown office was a veritable fortress. Physical access was strictly controlled by coded keycards, high-definition security cameras, and a remarkably loyal executive assistant. Breaking in after hours was entirely out of the question. A cleaning staff infiltration was far too risky. I realized that I needed to hand-deliver a device myself, and Derek needed to willingly plug it into the wall and keep it powered on 24 hours a day without suspicion. I leaned forward and analyzed my son-in-law's psychological vulnerabilities. Derek was a hollow man, driven entirely by his massive ego and the desperate need to constantly project immense wealth. He obsessively collected vintage bourbon and frequently boasted about his extensive collection of rare imported cigars. That pride was the critical weak point. I smiled a cold, calculated smile. I told him to find the most expensive smart humidor available. Within 48 hours, Mitchell procured a custom-built solid Spanish cedar humidor that cost significantly more than most hard-working people earn in 6 months. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern luxury craftsmanship, featuring an integrated digital climate control system that wirelessly connected to a local internet network to regulate the internal temperature with absolute precision. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious high-tech luxury item that Derek would absolutely crave. But the polished wood finish was merely an elaborate distraction. Mitchell discreetly brought in a former intelligence technician to completely gut the internal electronics compartment. Hidden deep inside the main climate control module, perfectly spliced into the primary power supply unit, they meticulously installed a microscopic military-grade network bridge. Once connected to a local wireless network, the hidden bridge would silently bypass the primary firewall. I explicitly instructed the technician to also install a high-sensitivity audio bug directly near the ventilation intake grill. 2 days later, I scheduled a brief afternoon meeting with Derek at his sprawling downtown office. I carried the beautifully wrapped wooden crate myself, walking casually past the main security desk with the confident stride of a proud family member, bringing a belated holiday gift. Derek enthusiastically greeted me at the heavy glass door of his expansive executive suite, his charismatic smile firmly in place. I stepped inside the room, silently noting the precise layout of the space. His private server rack and primary network router were securely housed in a ventilated cabinet, located just behind his massive mahogany desk. I carefully set the heavy wooden crate down on an elegant glass side table and offered him a warm congratulatory handshake. I told him that the expensive gift was to celebrate his phenomenal success over the past year. Derek eagerly tore into the thick wrapping paper, his eyes lighting up with unadulterated greed the very second he saw the polished Spanish cedar and the sleek digital display screen. He ran his hands smoothly over the beautiful wood, openly marveling at the incredible craftsmanship. I casually explained that the delicate internal climate control system absolutely needed to be plugged into a continuous power source and actively linked to his private office network to monitor the humidity levels accurately. Derek did not hesitate for a single second. Eager to immediately display his shiny new status symbol, he carefully carried the heavy humidor directly to the wide credenza located right behind his main desk. It was positioned perfectly, resting less than 3 feet away from his highly encrypted private server rack. He quickly plugged the thick power cord into the wall outlet and seamlessly connected the new device. I stood perfectly still, quietly watching the small blue indicator light blink softly on the front panel of the expensive humidor. It was the crucial visual signal confirming that the hidden network bridge was actively establishing a secure connection directly to Mitchell's remote server. Derek slowly turned back to me, beaming with absolute pride, completely unaware that he had just willingly invited a lethal digital parasite into the very heart of his heavily guarded financial empire. He thanked me profusely, excitedly, offering me a glass of his best scotch to celebrate the occasion. I politely declined the offer, citing a busy afternoon schedule, and cheerfully wished him a highly productive day. As I walked out of the glass doors and stepped into the quiet elevator, the heavy burden of my deeply suppressed rage began to slowly lift. I drove home and walked purposefully into my secluded study. I locked the heavy, solid oak door behind me, ensuring absolute privacy. I walked over to my antique desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and retrieved the encrypted black laptop Mitchell had configured for me. I booted up the secured system typed in the passphrase and launched the primary monitoring interface. The screen flickered brightly to life, instantly displaying a continuous stream of raw, decrypted financial data as Mitchell's elite team successfully bypassed the internal firewall and began silently siphoning Thorn Capital's hidden ledgers. I reached out and picked up a pair of professional-grade noise-canceling headphones. I plugged the cable into the audio jack, slipped the padded cups over my ears, and clicked the switch to initiate the live audio feed. For a brief moment, there was only the faint hum of the office ventilation system. Then the ambient soundscape suddenly sharpened with terrifying precision. I could plainly hear the distinct heavy footsteps of someone pacing back and forth across the polished hardwood floor. It was Derek. He was completely alone inside his locked office, muttering aggressively to himself. The charming, perfectly polished performance he effortlessly maintained for the general public was completely stripped away. The raw voice echoing through my headphones was deeply strained, harsh, and laced with a frantic, desperate energy. I slowly sat back in my large leather executive chair, tightly closing my eyes, as the immense reality of the situation washed completely over me. I was no longer a helpless spectator standing on the outside. I was a ghost operating invisibly inside his most private room. I took a slow, deep breath, holding myself perfectly still in the shadows, and quietly began to listen to the monster's true, unfiltered voice. The audio feed crackled with the heavy, uneven thud of dress shoes striking the hardwood floor. Derek was pacing like a caged animal. A few seconds later, the distinct click of the heavy office door opening and closing echoed through my headphones. Another set of footsteps entered the room, lighter and more hesitant. It was Trent. The arrogant, swaggering parasite I had confronted in my daughter's living room just weeks ago sounded completely out of breath, his voice laced with a raw, vibrating panic. He asked Derek what the hell was going on with the quarterly distribution accounts. He said his access had been restricted and that 3 major clients were actively threatening to pull their portfolios by the end of the week if they did not receive their guaranteed returns. I sat completely still in the dark silence of my study, my fingers gripping the edge of my antique desk as I waited for my son-in-law to provide a perfectly polished, logical explanation. Instead of a confident dismissal, Derek let out a sharp, venomous string of curses. He told his brother to shut up and lower his voice. The pristine, charismatic facade he wore for the public was completely gone. His voice was ragged, dripping with exhaustion and malice. Derek aggressively whispered that there were no distribution accounts left to pull from. He told Trent that the liquidity pool was entirely dry. I frowned, leaning closer to the laptop screen as the decrypted financial data from Mitchell's team began to cascade down the monitor in real time, perfectly aligning with the audio intercept. Trent's voice cracked as he asked how that was even possible. He reminded Derek that they had just secured $15 million in new capital last month. Derek's response was a chilling masterpiece of corporate sociopathy. He coldly explained that the new capital had already been routed to pay the guaranteed returns of the initial investors from the previous year. He admitted that there was no actual investment portfolio. There were no proprietary trading algorithms and no high-yield offshore bonds. Thorn Capital was not a boutique financial firm. It was a massive bleeding Ponzi scheme, and the foundation was rapidly collapsing under its own unsustainable weight. The sheer scale of the fraud was staggering, but the conversation was about to take a far more terrifying turn. Trent began to hyperventilate. The audio picked up the sound of him stumbling backward and bumping into a heavy leather chair. He was practically sobbing as he brought up the most pressing, dangerous liability on their books. Trent asked Derek what they were going to do about the $40 million they owed the consortium on the South Side. My blood ran completely cold. I knew the criminal landscape of Chicago very well. I knew exactly who operated out of the industrial sectors on the South Side. They were a notoriously violent Eastern European syndicate that used legitimate-looking private equity groups to silently wash their illicit cash. Derek had not just defrauded wealthy tech entrepreneurs and greedy corporate executives. He had knowingly taken tens of millions of dollars from ruthless, organized criminals who did not send cease and desist letters when their money went missing. They sent armed enforcers to collect their debts in blood. Trent was losing his mind. He told Derek that the syndicate's intermediaries had been calling his private line all morning. They were demanding a full audit of their principal investment by the end of the year. Trent whimpered that if those men realized the money was gone, they would not just liquidate the company. They would brutally execute both of them and bury them in an unmarked grave. Derek slammed his fist down on his mahogany desk, the sudden violent noise causing my headphones to spike with static. He commanded his brother to pull himself together and act like a man. Derek promised that he had a comprehensive exit strategy firmly in place. He assured Trent that a massive cash injection was imminent. He revealed his plan to host an opulent, high-profile gala at his estate on Christmas evening. He told Trent that he had specifically targeted a new group of incredibly wealthy, highly naive foreign investors who were attending the party. He guaranteed that he would close the final round of funding that night, completely replenish the syndicate's baseline account to keep them temporarily satisfied, and quietly divert the remaining funds into an untraceable offshore ledger. I slowly removed the headphones, laying them gently on the desk. The glowing blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the absolute horror settling deep inside my chest. I had initially assumed that Derek was merely an arrogant, greedy narcissist attempting to manipulate my daughter for access to my family's wealth. I thought he was playing a long, calculated game to secure a comfortable, luxurious lifestyle. The truth was infinitely more dangerous. Derek Thorne was a profoundly desperate man. He was drowning in an ocean of toxic debt, surrounded by violent predators, and desperately balancing on a razor-thin wire over a bottomless abyss. In the cutthroat world of commercial logistics, I had seen firsthand what happens when a cornered animal realizes that the walls are closing in. They do not simply surrender. They lash out with unpredictable, catastrophic violence, blindly destroying absolutely anything and anyone standing in their immediate vicinity. My daughter was sleeping in the same house as a man who was actively being hunted by the dangerous mob. She was sharing a bed with a sociopath who viewed human beings as nothing more than disposable assets. If Derek's Christmas gala failed to produce the necessary capital, or if the syndicate decided to move up their collection timeline, Natalie would be caught directly in the crossfire. Derek would not hesitate for a single second to sacrifice her if it meant buying himself enough time to escape. I picked up my encrypted phone and immediately dialed Mitchell Carter. He answered on the first ring, his tone indicating he had also been reviewing the intercepted data. I told Mitchell that we needed to accelerate our timeline. I explained that we were no longer just dismantling a corporate fraud. We were executing a hostile hostage rescue. Mitchell agreed, stating that his forensic accountants were already actively tracing the exact routing numbers Derek planned to use for his offshore escape fund. Mitchell warned me that we had to be incredibly precise with our next move. He stated that if we tipped our hand too early, Derek would panic and flee the country tonight, leaving a trail of financial devastation and potentially taking Natalie with him as leverage. I told Mitchell that Derek was too arrogant to run before his Christmas gala. His massive ego convinced him that he could pull off one final, magnificent heist to save his crumbling empire. He truly believed he was smarter than the syndicate, smarter than the foreign investors, and certainly smarter than his aging father-in-law. We would use that towering arrogance against him. We would let him spend the next few weeks meticulously planning his grand Christmas salvation, completely unaware that we were quietly laying the explosive charges directly beneath the floorboards of his operation. I ended the call and walked over to the large bay window in my study. The city of Chicago stretched out before me, a sprawling grid of glowing lights and deep, dangerous shadows. Somewhere out there in the wealthy suburbs, my daughter was navigating the treacherous halls of a $5 million mansion, tiptoeing around a man who was quietly unraveling into a state of sheer violent panic. The bruising I had seen on her temple during Thanksgiving suddenly took on a much darker, far more terrifying context. Derek was not just hitting her out of a sense of domestic control. He was hitting her because the immense pressure of his fraudulent life was finally boiling over, and she was the only available target he could safely abuse without consequence. I placed my hand against the cold glass of the window, making a silent, unbreakable vow. Derek Thorne had chosen Christmas night to secure his ultimate salvation. I would ensure that it became the night of his absolute, inescapable destruction. The following morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive, overcast sky that perfectly mirrored the dark reality I was navigating. I was sitting in my private study drinking a cup of bitter black coffee when my encrypted phone buzzed. It was Mitchell. He did not bother with a polite greeting. He simply told me that the Trojan horse had worked perfectly. The digital bridge hidden inside the expensive humidor had successfully bypassed Derek's internal security perimeter overnight. Mitchell's elite team of forensic hackers had spent the last 8 hours quietly dismantling the final layers of military-grade encryption shielding Thorne Capital's primary servers. He told me he was sending over the unencrypted server logs and the raw master ledgers right now. A few seconds later, my secure laptop chimed loudly. I opened the newly delivered files, my eyes scanning the endless rows of complex financial data. It was a massive labyrinth of offshore routing numbers, phantom investments, and fabricated returns. But Mitchell had already highlighted the most critical documents for my immediate review. He directed my attention to a specific subfolder buried deep within a nested directory labeled simply as Corporate Liabilities. I clicked on the folder. My screen populated with dozens of high-resolution scanned contracts. These were not standard corporate debt agreements. These were the private, heavily guarded loan documents, tying Thorne Capital directly to the violent Eastern European syndicate operating on the south side of Chicago. I leaned closer to the monitor, my reading glasses perched on the bridge of my nose, as I meticulously reviewed the heavily redacted pages. The terms of the loans were absolutely staggering, featuring predatory interest rates and brutal collateral stipulations that no legitimate banking institution would ever legally authorize. Derek had borrowed $40 million in a series of rapidly escalating cash infusions over the past 2 years. The syndicate had funneled the dirty money through a complex web of anonymous shell companies relying on Thorne Capital to wash the funds clean through fabricated real estate acquisitions and phantom tech startups. But as the Ponzi scheme began to aggressively hemorrhage capital, Derek had clearly been forced to renegotiate the terms under immense duress. The most recent documents included severe default penalties. If Thorne Capital failed to provide a full audit and the required return on investment by the end of the fiscal year, the syndicate was legally entitled to seize every single corporate asset, real estate holding, and private bank account associated with the managing directors of the firm. I felt a tight knot of pure anxiety form in my stomach. The dangerous men holding this illegal debt were not going to file a civil lawsuit when they realized the money was completely gone. They were going to dispatch armed collectors to liquidate Derek's life. But as I scrolled down to the final page of the master loan agreement to examine the signature line, my blood ran completely cold. The name signed at the bottom of the syndicate loan was not Derek Thorne. It was not Trent Thorne. The dark ink sprawling across the legally binding document declaring full personal and corporate liability for $40 million in illicit mob debt belonged to my daughter. I stared at the signature, completely paralyzed. It was Natalie Stanton. Her name was signed on every single page, initializing every brutal clause and every predatory penalty. I pulled up the subsequent contracts in the digital folder, my hands shaking violently as I clicked rapidly through the remaining files. Every piece of illegal debt, every fraudulent shell company, every phantom offshore account was legally registered to her. Derek had completely removed his own name from the toxic liabilities. He had meticulously forged his wife's signature on every single document. The sheer, breathtaking malice of his strategy hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Natalie was completely unaware of the financial empire she supposedly controlled. She had absolutely no access to the accounts, no knowledge of the violent syndicate, and no idea that she was the sole legal owner of a massive collapsing criminal enterprise. Derek had not just built a gilded cage to isolate her from her family and friends. He had systematically built a legal and financial guillotine, positioning her directly beneath the heavy blade, while he comfortably held the release rope in his own hands. The ultimate betrayal was so profound, so utterly devoid of basic human empathy, that it momentarily robbed me of my ability to breathe. I picked up my phone and called Mitchell back immediately, my voice trembling with a terrifying, unbridled rage that I could barely contain. I told him exactly what I had just found in the liability folders. Mitchell remained perfectly quiet for a long moment, before delivering the final devastating analysis of the situation. He explained Derek's endgame with chilling clarity. Derek knew the Ponzi scheme was entirely unsalvageable. The upcoming Christmas gala was never about saving the failing firm. It was a final, desperate cash grab. Derek planned to collect the last round of investments from his wealthy guests, route the clean money directly into an untraceable offshore account under his own name, and immediately flee the country under the cover of darkness. He was going to vanish into the wind, leaving his battered wife behind to take the ultimate fall for his crimes. When the federal investigators inevitably raided Thorn Capital for massive financial fraud, they would find Natalie's name plastered on all the holding companies. When the violent cartel enforcers showed up at the suburban mansion looking for their missing $40 million, they would find the legal guarantor of their debt, completely alone and defenseless. Derek fully intended to sacrifice my daughter's life to purchase his own freedom. I slowly closed the laptop, a dark, absolute silence falling over my study. My son-in-law had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. He had planned to use the woman I loved more than anything in the world as a human shield against a swarm of federal agents and ruthless killers. He thought he was walking away with a fortune while my daughter burned in his place. He thought his master plan was completely flawless. He did not realize that I now possessed the exact blueprint of his destruction. The financial investigation had served its purpose perfectly. It was no longer a mission to simply bankrupt an arrogant man. It had officially pivoted into a high-stakes rescue operation. I stood up from my desk, the lingering shock completely evaporating, replaced by a cold, surgical determination. Derek Thorne wanted to play a game of life and death on Christmas night. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. He believed he controlled the board, but he was entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just changed all the rules. I would not allow my daughter to become collateral damage in his pathetic, cowardly escape. I would meticulously dismantle every single avenue of his planned departure. By the time he realized the terrifying absolute magnitude of his fatal error, the heavy steel doors of his own carefully constructed, inescapable prison would be permanently locked around him forever. The bitter winter wind howled fiercely against the thick glass of my study window, but the chill inside the room was far more profound. I sat perfectly still in my large leather chair, a heavy crystal glass of vintage whiskey resting firmly in my right hand. Mitchell sat quietly across from me, his eyes fixed intensely on the glowing monitor of the encrypted laptop. For 3 agonizing days, we had been monitoring the continuous audio feed transmitted from the hidden network bridge inside Derek's office. We had listened to his desperate phone calls, his frantic negotiations, and his pathetic attempts to secure more capital. But on that particular Thursday afternoon, the tenor of the surveillance feed shifted dramatically. The heavy polished door of Derek's executive suite clicked open, and the unmistakable sound of my daughter's voice filtered through the high-definition audio bug. Natalie sounded nervous, her breathing uneven, as she asked Derek if he had a moment to explain something she had found in the mail. My posture stiffened immediately. I leaned closer to the speakers, my heart hammering against my ribs. Trent was already in the room, his arrogant scoff echoing in the background, as he muttered a petty complaint about interruptions. Derek sighed heavily, scraping through the microphone with an air of manufactured patience. He asked her what could possibly be so important that she needed to interrupt a highly critical strategy session. Natalie's voice trembled slightly, but she pushed forward with a courage that made me proud. She explained that a piece of misdirected bank mail had arrived at the house that morning. It was an account statement for a corporate holding company, and her name was listed as the primary guarantor. She read the balance aloud, her voice cracking, as she mentioned a negative balance of over $4 million. She asked her husband, the man she trusted with her life, why a massive corporate debt was legally attached to her personal identity. She pleaded with him to explain why her signature was printed on a financial document she had never seen before. The silence that followed her question was suffocating. I could hear the tapping of a pen against a wooden desk. When Derek finally spoke, his customary charismatic facade was completely gone. His voice was no longer warm. It was a cold, flat, venomous hiss. He told her she was overstepping her boundaries. He coldly instructed her to hand over the document and forget she had ever seen it, claiming it was just a simple clerical error made by an incompetent accountant. But Natalie did not back down. For the first time in her marriage, she stood her ground. She told him that she had called the bank directly before coming to the office. She revealed that the bank representative had confirmed there were 12 other holding companies registered exclusively in her name. The panic in her voice was palpable as she demanded to know what he was doing with her identity. She asked him if he was using her to hide his corporate liabilities. The sudden scrape of a heavy chair being pushed backward pierced the audio feed. Derek had immediately stood up. I could hear his heavy footsteps rapidly closing the distance between them. Trent let out a low, amused chuckle in the background, a sound that made my blood run cold. Derek's voice dropped to a terrifying guttural whisper as he invaded her personal space. He told her she was acting like an ungrateful, hysterical child. He cruelly reminded her of the expensive lifestyle he provided, the luxury cars and the sprawling mansion. Then he delivered a line so steeped in malice that it stopped the breath in my lungs. "You sign the papers, Natalie," he growled. "You do not ask questions. You are a trophy, act like one." The cruelty of his words caused Natalie to break. I could hear her sobs. She told him he was hurting her, stepping away from him. Through her tears, she found a final shred of defiance. She told him she was immediately leaving the office and driving straight to my house. She threatened to call her father and show me the bank statements. The physical response was instantaneous and brutal. A sickening, sharp smack echoed loudly through my headphones. It was the sound of a heavy hand striking human flesh with tremendous force. A sharp gasp of pain escaped my daughter's lips, followed by the dull thud of her body hitting the hardwood floor. Trent burst into a loud, mocking fit of laughter in the background, entertained by the horrific display of domestic violence. I did not realize how tightly I was gripping my heavy whiskey glass until the thick crystal completely shattered in my hand. The glass exploded into a dozen jagged shards, slicing deeply into my palm and fingers. The amber liquid mixed seamlessly with my own warm blood, spilling over my knuckles and dripping silently onto the surface of my antique desk. I did not feel the physical pain. Every single nerve ending in my body was entirely consumed by an inferno of primitive rage. I stood up from my chair, my breathing heavy. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to march to my vehicle, drive to his downtown office with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun, and permanently remove Derek Thorne from the face of the earth. I wanted to kick down his door and beat him until he could no longer speak. I took 3 steps toward the door of my study, my bleeding hand leaving a dark trail of crimson drops on the carpet. But Mitchell stood up and placed a strong hand squarely on my chest. He did not say a word, but his eyes stared directly into mine, silently demanding that I regain my composure. He pointed toward the glowing laptop screen, a grim reminder of the bigger picture. Mitchell was absolutely right. A shotgun blast would only get me arrested for premeditated murder. If I went to prison, my only daughter would be left unprotected at the mercy of the ruthless syndicate enforcers who would inevitably come looking for their stolen $40 million. Violence was the tool of an undisciplined mind. I needed to employ the strategy of a seasoned corporate executioner. I took a long, deep breath, forcing the haze of anger to recede into a controlled corner of my mind. I reached for a clean linen handkerchief on my desk and tightly wrapped it around my bleeding hand, applying heavy pressure to the lacerations. I sat back down in my leather chair, my eyes locked onto the audio receiver. The emotional father within me had just died, completely replaced by a ruthless architect of destruction. Derek Thorne had just signed his own death warrant. He wanted to use my daughter as a shield to secure his wealth. I would ensure that his desperate pursuit of capital became the very instrument of his demise. I looked over at Mitchell, my voice precise. I told him to accelerate the timeline and finalize the financial kill switch. The trap was born in that quiet, blood-stained room, and Christmas night would be his execution. The very next morning, the bitterly cold, freezing winter air sharply bit at my aging face as I drove my vehicle back down to the familiar, dilapidated diner located on the dangerous south side of Chicago. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the gray morning light. I walked slowly through the familiar grease-stained glass doors and immediately found Mitchell quietly sitting in the exact same torn vinyl booth in the back. He had his encrypted laptop open, surrounded by stacks of heavily redacted financial files. I did not bother ordering coffee. I slid into the booth across from him, placed my briefcase on the sticky table, and snapped the brass latches open. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder containing the original investment contracts I had signed with Derek 3 years ago. When I initially gave him the $2 million seed gift to purchase his sprawling suburban mansion and establish his firm, I allowed him to believe it was a purely generous gesture from a doting father-in-law. I let him think he had expertly charmed me into handing over a massive fortune with absolutely no strings attached. But you do not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat logistics industry by handing over capital on blind faith. Mitchell raised an eyebrow as I pushed the heavy stack of legal documents across the table. He asked me what I was looking for. I told him to turn to page 47. Mitchell flipped through the thick stack of dense legal jargon, his eyes scanning the incredibly fine print buried deep within the corporate structuring agreements. As he read the specific paragraph I had highlighted, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. When my corporate attorneys originally drafted that contract, I instructed them to insert a highly specific, highly lethal morality and legal compliance clause. It was buried under layers of mundane tax stipulations and standard operational liabilities, ensuring Derek would never actually read it before signing his name on the dotted line. The clause stated that upon the discovery of any evidence indicating criminal fraud, gross financial negligence, or illegal operations, my initial $2 million investment instantly converted from a passive financial gift into an active, overriding corporate lien. The sheer power of that hidden clause was absolute. It legally granted me the immediate unilateral authority to freeze and seize every single personal and corporate asset tied to Thorne Capital. I did not need a drawn-out civil court order. I did not need a judge to grant me temporary injunctions. The clause functioned as an automatic financial kill switch. The moment I triggered the legal mechanism with the banking institutions, every bank account, every offshore routing number, and every piece of property registered to Derek Thorne would be instantly locked down. He would not be able to transfer a single dollar. He would not be able to buy a plane ticket, pay his corrupt lawyers, or access the millions of dollars he had carefully stolen from his naive investors. The cage would drop with absolute terrifying finality. Mitchell looked up from the contract, his voice filled with genuine professional admiration. He told me it was a brilliant, utterly ruthless piece of legal architecture. He explained that we could use the intercepted audio recordings and the decrypted offshore bank ledgers as the necessary legal burden of proof to officially activate the compliance clause. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved a gold fountain pen, and quickly signed the accompanying legal affidavits. I pushed the signed documents back across the table, formally granting Mitchell the complete executive authority to execute the financial strike on my behalf. I told him to coordinate directly with the major banking compliance departments. I wanted the freeze orders fully processed and resting quietly in their automated systems, waiting for my final verbal authorization to execute the lockdown. But paralyzing Derek financially was only the first half of the execution. Freezing his stolen wealth would prevent him from escaping the country, but it would not protect my daughter from the violent syndicate enforcers who were actively hunting for their missing $40 million. We needed a blunt, overwhelming force to physically remove Derek from the estate and completely neutralize the mob threat before it ever reached Natalie. We needed the federal government. Mitchell closed the leather folder and securely packed it into his own briefcase. He told me he had maintained a highly confidential relationship with a senior field director inside the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a contact he had cultivated over years of discreet crisis management operations. I instructed Mitchell to carefully package the decrypted Ponzi scheme ledgers, the forged syndicate loan documents, and the detailed offshore wire transfers into a single anonymous digital dossier. We were going to hand the federal government the biggest financial prosecution of the decade on a silver platter. But we were not going to hand it over blindly. Mitchell was to leak the information to his federal contact with a very specific, non-negotiable operational condition. The agency had to coordinate their tactical raid precisely for the night of Derek's extravagant Christmas gala. I knew exactly how federal agencies operated. When presented with undeniable evidence of massive corporate fraud and an imminent flight risk, they would mobilize their strike teams rapidly to secure the primary suspect and seize the physical servers before any digital evidence could be wiped. By timing the anonymous leak perfectly, we were effectively transforming the federal government into our own private extraction team. Derek planned to use his glamorous Christmas party to finalize his ultimate scam, surrounded by wealthy investors and expensive champagne. He thought he was going to disappear into the night as a newly minted millionaire. Instead, the moment his party concluded, the financial kill switch would activate, instantly draining his entire empire. Seconds later, federal agents would breach his front doors to drag him away in handcuffs, completely dismantling his operation and permanently removing him from my daughter's life. The brutal syndicate debt would legally fall entirely on Derek and his brother, as the federal investigation would definitively prove my daughter's signatures had been meticulously forged. Mitchell nodded in complete agreement, understanding the absolute perfection of the timeline. He told me he would personally handle the encrypted transmission to the federal task force and guarantee the banking algorithms were primed for the targeted strike. I finished my black coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the severe reality of the moment. We had systematically removed every possible variable. The trap was perfectly constructed, meticulously loaded, and completely invisible to the arrogant monster sitting comfortably in his suburban mansion. I stood up from the vinyl booth, shook Mitchell's hand, and walked out into the freezing Chicago morning. The heavy, dark clouds above were finally beginning to break, revealing brief, piercing flashes of cold sunlight. I got into my car and drove back toward the city, my mind perfectly clear and my heart completely devoid of any hesitation. The countdown to Christmas night had officially begun, and I was finally ready to stand back and watch his corrupt world burn to the ground. The morning sun rose over Chicago, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered streets. My hand was heavily bandaged, a dull, throbbing ache radiating through my knuckles, serving as a constant physical reminder of the violent truth I had witnessed. I drove back down to the south side, navigating the treacherous winter roads, until I reached the dilapidated diner where Mitchell Carter was waiting. He sat in the same cracked vinyl booth, his posture rigid and alert. As I slid into the seat across from him, I did not order coffee. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. It was the original investment contract I had signed with Derek Thorne 3 years ago. When I initially gave him the $2 million seed capital to launch his firm and purchase that sprawling estate, I had played the part of the generous, supportive father-in-law perfectly. I let Derek believe he had charmed me into writing a massive check with absolutely no strings attached. But you do not survive 4 decades fighting union bosses and corporate predators by handing over a fortune on blind faith alone. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, his sharp eyes scanning the thick stack of paper. He asked me what I was looking for. I told him to turn directly to page 47. Mitchell flipped past the standard equity terms, the tax stipulations, and the routine operational liabilities. As his eyes found the specific paragraph I had highlighted, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. When my corporate attorneys originally drafted that seed contract, I had instructed them to bury a highly lethal, completely non-negotiable morality and legal compliance clause deep within the boilerplate text. I knew Derek was too arrogant to read the fine print. The clause stated that upon the discovery of any concrete evidence indicating criminal fraud, gross financial negligence, or illegal enterprise, my initial $2 million investment instantly converted from a passive financial gift into an active, overriding corporate lien. The sheer devastating power of that hidden legal architecture was absolute. It legally granted me the immediate unilateral authority to freeze and seize every single personal and corporate asset tied to Thorne Capital. I did not need to file a lengthy civil lawsuit. I did not need to petition a sympathetic judge for a temporary injunction. The compliance clause functioned as an automatic, unassailable financial kill switch. The very second I triggered the legal mechanism with the respective banking institutions, every single checking account, every offshore routing number, and every piece of real estate registered to Derek Thorne would be instantly locked down. He would not be able to transfer a single dollar. He would not be able to buy a plane ticket, pay his defense attorneys, or access the $40 million he had desperately stolen from his investors. The cage would drop with absolute, terrifying finality. Mitchell looked up from the contract, his voice filled with genuine professional admiration. He told me it was a brilliant, utterly ruthless piece of legal trap-making. He explained that we could easily use the intercepted audio recordings and the decrypted offshore bank ledgers as the necessary burden of proof to officially activate the compliance clause. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved a gold fountain pen, and quickly signed the accompanying legal affidavits. I pushed the signed documents back across the sticky laminate table, formally granting Mitchell the complete executive authority to execute the financial strike on my behalf. I told him to coordinate directly with the major banking compliance departments immediately. I wanted the freeze orders fully processed and resting quietly within their automated systems, waiting for my final verbal authorization to execute the total lockdown. But paralyzing Derek financially was only the first half of the execution. Freezing his stolen wealth would effectively prevent him from escaping the country, but it would not protect my daughter from the violent syndicate enforcers who were actively hunting for their missing $40 million. We needed a blunt, overwhelming force to physically remove Derek from the estate and completely neutralize the mob threat before it ever reached Natalie. We needed the full weight of the federal government. Mitchell closed the leather folder and securely packed it into his own briefcase. He told me he had maintained a highly confidential, long-standing relationship with a senior field director inside the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a contact he had carefully cultivated over years of discreet crisis management operations. I instructed Mitchell to carefully package the decrypted Ponzi scheme ledgers, the forged syndicate loan documents, and the detailed offshore wire transfers into a single anonymous digital dossier. We were going to hand the federal government the biggest financial prosecution of the decade on a silver platter. But we were not going to hand it over blindly. Mitchell was to leak the information to his federal contact with a very specific, absolutely non-negotiable operational condition. The agency had to coordinate their tactical raid precisely for the night of Derek's extravagant Christmas gala. I knew exactly how federal agencies operated when presented with undeniable evidence of massive corporate fraud and an imminent flight risk. They would mobilize their strike teams rapidly to secure the primary suspect and seize the physical servers before any digital evidence could be wiped clean. By timing the anonymous leak perfectly, we were effectively transforming the federal government into our own private extraction team. Derek planned to use his glamorous Christmas party to finalize his ultimate scam, surrounded by wealthy investors and flowing expensive champagne. He thought he was going to disappear into the freezing night as a newly minted millionaire, leaving Natalie to face the wrath of the cartel. Instead, the moment his party concluded, the financial kill switch would activate instantly, draining his entire empire to absolute zero. Seconds later, federal agents would breach his massive front doors to drag him away in handcuffs, completely dismantling his operation and permanently removing him from my daughter's life. The brutal syndicate debt would legally fall entirely on Derek and his brother, as the federal investigation would definitively prove my daughter's signatures had been meticulously and criminally forged. Mitchell nodded in complete agreement, understanding the absolute perfection of the timeline. He told me he would personally handle the encrypted transmission to the federal task force and guarantee the banking algorithms were primed for the targeted strike. I finished my black coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the severe reality of the moment. We had systematically removed every possible variable from the equation. The trap was perfectly constructed, meticulously loaded, and completely invisible to the arrogant monster sitting comfortably in his suburban mansion. I stood up from the vinyl booth, shook Mitchell's hand, and walked out into the freezing Chicago morning. The heavy, dark clouds above were finally beginning to break, revealing brief, piercing flashes of cold sunlight. I got into my car and drove back toward the city, my mind perfectly clear and my heart completely devoid of any hesitation. I tightly gripped the heavy black leather steering wheel, entirely ready for the final war. The grandfather clock in the sprawling foyer of Derek's mansion chimed softly, signaling that it was exactly 11 o'clock at night. The opulent Christmas gala was in full swing, completely filling the massive estate with the sounds of clinking crystal soft jazz music and the hollow, echoing laughter of the exceedingly wealthy. I stood quietly near the edge of the grand living room, a half-empty glass of expensive bourbon resting comfortably in my hand. I was wearing a tailored black tuxedo, playing the role of the jovial, supportive father-in-law to absolute perfection. From my vantage point, I could see everything. I watched Derek holding court near the towering, brilliantly lit Christmas tree. He was surrounded by a small, exclusive circle of international investors, his charismatic smile flashing brightly as he poured them another round of vintage champagne. He was in his absolute element, weaving a masterful web of financial promises and guaranteed returns. He was charming them with practiced ease, spinning fabricated tales of revolutionary real estate developments and unprecedented algorithmic trading models, securing the final massive capital injections he so desperately needed to fund his cowardly escape into the night. He looked so incredibly confident, so completely assured of his own untouchable brilliance. He had no idea that he was standing on a trapdoor that was about to swing wide open. I shifted my gaze to my daughter. Natalie was sitting on a plush velvet sofa across the room. She looked like a beautifully dressed ghost. Her eyes were glazed over, her posture rigid and perfectly still. Derek had clearly forced her to consume a heavy dose of anxiety medication before the first guest even arrived, effectively suppressing her natural personality and ensuring she would remain perfectly pliant, quiet, and completely unable to cause a dramatic scene in front of his crucial high-net-worth targets. Trent was hovering near the heavy wooden doors of the private study, swirling an expensive scotch in his glass, openly mocking the catering staff under his breath, and occasionally shooting me a smug, condescending smirk. He looked at me as if I were a clueless, obsolete relic of a bygone era. I simply smiled back at him, raising my bourbon glass in a silent, polite toast. The arrogance radiating from the two brothers was almost suffocating. They truly believed they had won. They believed they had successfully manipulated an old man, trapped a helpless woman, and stolen a massive fortune without leaving a single trace of consequence. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. The smooth, cold metal of the device felt heavy in my palm. The time for passive observation had officially expired. I unlocked the glowing screen, opened the highly secure messaging application, and deliberately selected Mitchell Carter's contact profile. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard for a fraction of a second. I thought about the fading yellow bruise on my daughter's temple. I thought about the $40 million in violent syndicate debt criminally forged in her name. I typed a single definitive word: execute. I pressed send, slipped the phone securely back into my pocket, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my strong bourbon. In the quiet, invisible realm of global digital finance, a catastrophic financial slaughter had just begun. Miles away in a dark, secured office building, Mitchell received my encrypted message. I knew exactly what was happening at that precise second. Mitchell executed the legal compliance clause instantly, transmitting the verified fraud documentation and my overriding corporate lien directly to the automated compliance mainframes of every major banking institution tied to Thorn Capital. The response was immediate and absolutely merciless. Deep within the heavily fortified server farms of the global banks complex, security algorithms engaged with terrifying, unyielding speed. The financial kill switch was fully activated. Derek's primary corporate checking accounts, which had been artificially inflated with millions of dollars in stolen investor capital just moments prior, were instantly completely frozen. The massive outgoing international wire transfers that Derek had meticulously scheduled to secretly route his newly acquired funds into his untraceable offshore escape accounts slammed forcefully into an impenetrable digital wall. The highly advanced banking mainframes instantly flagged the massive anomalous transactions as critically fraudulent, immediately seizing the digital routing pathways and permanently locking down the international wire bridges. The severe security alerts cascaded rapidly across the global financial network, triggering secondary lockdowns on his personal credit lines, his massive corporate expense accounts, and his heavily guarded hidden domestic safety nets. In less than 60 seconds, the sprawling, incredibly complex financial empire that Derek Thorne had spent years building through vicious lies, ruthless manipulation, and cruel intimidation was completely and utterly vaporized. His access to wealth was permanently legally severed. His massive, stolen net worth plummeted rapidly to absolute zero. The devastation, however, was not solely limited to the invisible digital realm. Simultaneously, the comprehensive anonymous dossier Mitchell had meticulously prepared was transmitted directly to his senior contact inside the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The undeniable concrete evidence of massive corporate fraud, widespread signature forgery, and international money laundering hit the highly secured federal intelligence servers like a targeted, devastating missile strike. 2 miles away from the sprawling, softly lit suburban estate, sitting quietly in a darkened, frozen staging area directly behind an abandoned commercial strip mall, the federal strike team received the ultimate overriding green light. 24 heavily armed elite federal agents dressed in thick ballistic tactical gear and carrying specialized heavy breaching equipment rapidly loaded into a tightly coordinated silent fleet of unmarked black utility vehicles. The heavy, powerful engines roared fiercely to life in the freezing winter air as the massive tactical convoy mobilized, their bright headlights cutting sharply through the dark, snowy suburban streets as they sped directly toward Derek's opulent mansion. I stood quietly in the comforting warmth of the grand living room, carefully listening to the soft jazz music and the gentle, oblivious hum of wealthy conversation flowing around me. I watched Derek throw his head back and laugh heartily at a terrible joke a foreign investor had just made, his pristine white teeth gleaming brightly under the expensive, dripping crystal chandelier. It was a profoundly, incredibly surreal experience. I was looking directly at a highly arrogant, extremely dangerous man who was already completely, unequivocally dead, but whose brain simply had not registered the fatal, crushing trauma yet. The silent, digital slaughter was entirely complete, and the physical, heavily armed cavalry was rapidly approaching the iron gates. The grand clock ticked slowly, silently, counting down the final remaining minutes of his false reality. I took another incredibly slow, deliberate breath, physically steadying my own racing heart, fully prepared for the explosive, inevitable chaos that was about to unfold. The meticulously constructed, inescapable legal trap had finally clicked firmly shut around his incredibly arrogant neck, sealing his fate with absolute, terrifying certainty. Now I just had to stand there, hold my heavy glass of drink, and patiently, quietly wait for my incredibly arrogant son-in-law to finally realize that he was nothing more than a dead man walking blindly through a beautifully decorated graveyard. The massive mahogany doors of the grand foyer finally swung shut for the last time that evening, sealing the freezing winter wind outside. The lingering echoes of forced wealthy laughter slowly faded into a suffocating, heavy silence. The extravagant Christmas gala had officially concluded, leaving behind a sprawling landscape of half-empty crystal champagne flutes and discarded velvet napkins. The hired catering staff had been abruptly dismissed by Derek, ordered to clear out through the rear service entrance without making a single sound. I quietly followed my son-in-law as he led us away from the grand ballroom and into his private sunken living room at the back of the massive estate. The room was a monument to his towering ego, featuring a massive stone fireplace, dark leather furniture, and a pristine, incredibly expensive white Persian rug that covered the center of the polished hardwood floor. Only 4 of us remained in the quiet of the house. There was Derek, eagerly unbuttoning his tailored tuxedo jacket with a deep sigh of arrogant exhaustion. There was Trent, slumping heavily into a corner armchair, swirling the remnants of a dark scotch while aggressively loosening his silk tie. And then there was my daughter. Natalie looked like a beautifully dressed phantom. The heavy dose of anxiety medication Derek had forced upon her earlier in the evening was clearly beginning to wear off, leaving her in a state of fragile, trembling exhaustion. Her posture was completely rigid as she silently gathered a few stray wine glasses from the coffee table. She was desperate to keep the room perfect, desperate to avoid giving her husband any excuse to unleash his hidden wrath. I stood perfectly still near the archway of the private living room, my hands resting casually in my pockets, carefully observing the decaying dynamic. I watched my daughter's hands shaking violently as she reached across the low glass table to retrieve a partially full glass of dark red wine. Her movements were jerky and uncoordinated, heavily compromised by a mixture of profound physical exhaustion and pure unadulterated fear. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers slipping awkwardly against the smooth condensation on the outside of the expensive crystal stemware. It happened in an agonizing, terrifying slow motion. The heavy glass tipped forward, slipping entirely from her fragile grasp. It struck the edge of the glass table with a sharp, piercing crack, shattering into 3 large, jagged pieces. The dark crimson liquid violently exploded outward, cascading directly off the edge of the table and splashing heavily onto the center of Derek's pristine, immaculate white Persian rug. The dark red stain rapidly expanded across the expensive white fibers, looking exactly like a fresh pool of blood, bleeding into pure snow. The sound of the shattering crystal seemed to echo with a deafening volume through the silent room. Time completely stopped. I watched Natalie freeze in absolute paralyzing terror, her wide eyes locked onto the expanding red stain. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, immediately dropping to her knees on the floor. Her trembling hands frantically grabbed a small silk cocktail napkin in a desperate, futile attempt to scrub the dark liquid out of the expensive rug. She began to rapidly, breathlessly apologize, her voice cracking with a raw, desperate panic, that tore violently at my heart. Derek completely froze, his broad back turning rigidly stiff as he stared down at the ruined carpet. The charming, charismatic, perfectly polished facade that he had meticulously maintained for the entire evening instantly evaporated into thin air. The mask completely shattered, revealing the true horrific monster lurking directly beneath the surface. His face twisted into a mask of pure malice, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his crisp white collar. He did not say a single word. He did not yell or demand an explanation. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance between them with the terrifying silent speed of a striking predator. Before I could even register the sudden violent shift in his posture, Derek aggressively pulled his right arm back and viciously backhanded my daughter across the face. The sickening sharp crack of his heavy hand striking her delicate cheekbone echoed through the silent room with a horrifying clarity. The sheer, brutal force of the unexpected blow completely lifted Natalie off her hands and knees, violently throwing her backward. She hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud, her beautiful evening gown tangling around her legs as she scrambled desperately to shield her face from a second strike. A quiet, muffled sob escaped her lips as she curled into a tight, defensive ball on the floor, a dark, thin trickle of fresh blood immediately blooming from the corner of her split lip. The absolute cruelty of the strike was breathtaking, a casual, practiced display of total domestic dominance. I stood frozen in the archway, a towering, primitive inferno of rage, instantly consuming every single rational thought in my brain. My vision tunneled the edges of the room, blurring into darkness as I stared at my beautiful daughter, weeping softly on the hardwood floor. Every protective, violent instinct I possessed screamed at me to lunge across the room, tackle my son-in-law to the ground, and beat him until he stopped breathing entirely. But before I could move a single muscle, a low, cruel, utterly sickening chuckle drifted from the corner of the room. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto Trent. He had not even bothered to sit up from his comfortable, slouched position in the leather armchair. He simply took another slow, arrogant sip of his dark scotch, staring down at my terrified daughter with an expression of pure amusement. He swirled the liquor in his glass, letting out a satisfied, heavy sigh. Finally, Trent muttered, a wicked, patronizing smirk spreading widely across his face. Someone had to teach her to shut up and act right. She has been whining all night long. The sheer audacity of his vile comment was the exact catalyst I needed. The blinding, chaotic rage inside my chest instantly condensed into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I did not need to break their jaws with my bare hands. I did not need to scream or yell. I was an architect of complete systemic destruction, and they had just handed me the final justification to permanently end their pathetic lives. I took a deep breath. I walked forward with quiet authority, stepping over the shattered glass and placing my body firmly between Derek and my violently trembling daughter. Derek instantly puffed out his chest, stepping forward to challenge me, fully expecting an emotional argument. I ignored his pathetic posturing. I reached into my tailored tuxedo jacket, my hand perfectly calm. I retrieved my mobile phone, opening the keypad to dial a secure, untraceable number. It was a direct operational line I had not dialed on an open channel in 15 years. I pressed call and raised the device to my ear. Derek frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering in profound confusion. The line connected instantly. I stared directly into his dark eyes. "Bring them in," I commanded, and ended the call. I lowered my phone and slipped it smoothly back into the inner pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket. The sudden silence in the grand living room was thick and suffocating. Derek stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shifting rapidly from brief confusion to towering indignation. Then he threw his head back and let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed harshly against the high ceilings. It was a hollow, desperate sound, entirely devoid of any genuine amusement. He shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and looked at me as if I were a senile, pathetic old man who had completely lost touch with reality. Are you seriously calling the cops, old man? Derek sneered, his upper lip curling into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He took a confident step forward, closing the distance between us, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I play golf with the chief of police every single Sunday. I fund the municipal re-election campaigns. You think a couple of patrol officers are going to walk into my $5 million house and arrest me on the word of a washed-up logistics manager? He pointed a perfectly manicured finger down at my daughter, who was still weeping softly on the ruined white rug. She tripped and fell. She has been drinking heavy wine all night and she lost her balance. It is a tragic accident. It is your word against mine, Bill, and my word is backed by a legal team that costs more than your entire retirement portfolio. You have absolutely no proof of anything. Trent loudly set his crystal glass down on the heavy wooden side table, the sharp clink cutting through the tension. He stood up from his leather armchair, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He walked over to stand right beside his brother, crossing his arms over his chest. You really should have stayed in your lane, Bill. Trent mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. You are completely out of your depth here. Derek is untouchable in this town. You are just making a massive fool out of yourself. Why do you not just turn around, walk out the front door, and go back to your quiet, boring little life? We will take perfectly good care of Natalie. We always do. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, letting their arrogant, empty threats wash over me like a gentle breeze. I looked at the two brothers standing shoulder to shoulder, entirely convinced of their own absolute invincibility. My gaze shifted from Trent's foolish grin to Derek's aggressive glare. I did not feel any residual anger toward them. The towering inferno of rage that had consumed me just moments prior had completely burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I looked at Derek Thorne with an expression of pure, absolute pity. I did not call the local police, Derek, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating clarity. You fundamentally misunderstand the situation you are currently in. You think the police are your enemies tonight. You think they are coming here to arrest you for domestic violence. But you are wrong. The police are not coming to punish you. The police are the only people in the entire world who are going to save your miserable life tonight. Derek narrowed his eyes, the smug smile finally beginning to falter at the absolute certainty radiating from my voice. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. What the hell are you talking about? He demanded, his tone losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. I reached into the pocket of my tuxedo jacket once again. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the glowing screen and opened a custom-designed application interface that Mitchell Carter had securely installed for me earlier that week. When Derek had proudly plugged the expensive custom-built Spanish cedar humidor into his executive office wall, he had unwittingly invited a military-grade network bridge directly into his private digital ecosystem. That hidden digital parasite had not only bypassed his corporate financial firewalls, but it had also smoothly integrated itself into the overarching smart home operating system that controlled every single electronic function within his sprawling suburban estate. Derek had centralized his entire life onto a single, highly vulnerable digital network. I held the phone up so Derek could see the glowing screen. I am talking about consequences, Derek, I said softly. I pressed a single large red button in the center of the digital application. The response was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying. A loud, heavy electronic chime echoed simultaneously through every single room in the massive mansion. The overarching smart home system immediately engaged its ultimate lockdown protocol. The heavy reinforced steel security shutters originally designed and installed to keep dangerous intruders out of the luxurious estate suddenly roared to life. The mechanical grinding of industrial motors filled the air as the thick metal barriers began to rapidly unroll from their hidden ceiling compartments. They slammed down heavily over the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely blocking out the cold moonlight and plunging the living room into deep, isolating shadows. The thick steel plates locked into the reinforced floor grooves with a series of heavy metallic thuds that shook the hardwood beneath our feet. Simultaneously, the heavy electronic deadbolts on every single exterior door in the house loudly clicked shut, permanently sealing the exits with unbreakable mechanized force. Derek whipped his head around, staring in absolute wide-eyed horror, as his beautiful open-concept living space was rapidly transformed into an impenetrable claustrophobic steel vault. The soft, elegant ambient lighting automatically shifted to a harsh, cold emergency setting. The quiet hum of the climate control system was completely drowned out by the terrifying finality of the lockdown sequence. They were not just trapped inside a house. They were securely locked inside a heavily fortified cage, completely cut off from the outside world. "What did you just do?" Derek screamed, the raw panic finally bleeding openly into his voice. He lunged toward the wall, furiously tapping the sleek glass surface of the primary smart home control panel. He swiped his fingers desperately across the screen, trying to override the sudden lockdown. The panel flashed a bright, angry red warning. "Access denied. System override engaged." He pounded his fist against the unresponsive glass, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. "Open the doors, Bill. Open the doors right now." Trent stumbled backward, his arrogant smirk entirely erased, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed stare of a cornered animal. He looked frantically at the heavy steel shutters covering the windows, realizing that there was absolutely no way out. The invincible empire they thought they controlled was actively turning against them. I slowly walked over to my daughter, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring in stunned silence at the descending steel barriers. I gently took her by the arm and helped her to her feet, pulling her safely behind me. I kept my eyes firmly locked on Derek, who was currently hyperventilating near the useless control panel. "I told you that you misunderstand your reality," I said quietly. "The men who operate out of the South Side industrial sectors do not care about your police connections. They do not care about your expensive lawyers. They only care about the $40 million you stole from them. And right now, they are speeding toward your front gates. The only thing standing between you and them is the federal strike team arriving at your back door. I locked the shutters to keep the wolves out just long enough for the feds to drag you away." Before Derek could even process the devastating magnitude of my words, a sharp, piercing vibration shattered the tense silence in the room. It was coming from Derek's pocket. His mobile phone was violently buzzing. He reached down with trembling, uncoordinated fingers and pulled the device out. The caller identification flashed brightly across the screen. It was his primary offshore wealth manager calling from a secure international line. It was the man responsible for moving his stolen cash. Derek stared at the glowing name on the screen, his entire body going completely rigid. The final, inescapable reality of his absolute destruction was calling. The digital slaughter was complete. The physical cage was securely locked. The dawn of pure, unadulterated panic completely washed over his pale face. The Christmas execution was now in full, undeniable effect. Derek swiped his thumb across the glass screen, accepting the international call with a desperate motion. He pressed the phone against his ear, his knuckles turning white. He barked a command, demanding a status update on the massive outbound wire transfers he had scheduled an hour prior. The voice on the other end was tinny, leaking through the receiver, with a frantic pitch that echoed faintly in the suffocating silence of the locked living room. The wealth manager was hyperventilating, tumbling over his words as he delivered the catastrophic news. He explained that a massive compliance alert had just swept through the entire global banking network. Every corporate holding hidden proxy ledger and private checking account registered under the Thorn Capital umbrella had been subjected to an aggressive, instantaneous federal freeze. Derek pulled the phone away from his ear, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He tapped the screen, opening his mobile banking application. He bypassed the security scan, his eyes burning with furious denial. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second before the dashboard populated on the bright screen. The total available balance displayed across the top of his master account read exactly $0.00. A sickening gasp escaped his lips. He frantically refreshed the page, entirely convinced it was a simple network error or a temporary glitch. But the devastating number remained absolutely unchanged. The millions of dollars he had ruthlessly stolen, the massive fortune he believed would guarantee his escape into the night, had completely vanished into the digital void. Derek lost his grip on reality. He threw his mobile phone across the room, the device shattering violently against the heavy stone fireplace. He spun around, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his brother, who was standing paralyzed near the leather armchair. Derek screamed at Trent, his voice cracking with an unnatural pitch. He ordered Trent to immediately pull up the secondary proxy accounts, the hidden emergency funds they had reserved for worst-case scenarios. He demanded that Trent manually wire $5 million to their private offshore legal counsel, completely desperate to buy an aggressive defense before the federal raid commenced. Trent did not move. His hands were shaking violently as he reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out his own mobile device. The screen was already glowing brightly, completely flooded with a rapid, continuous stream of automated security alerts from his own personal banking institutions. The ruthless legal mechanism I had meticulously embedded within my original seed contract did not discriminate. It cast an incredibly wide, devastating net, targeting absolutely any financial entity loosely affiliated with the fraudulent operations of Thorn Capital. Trent stared down at his screen, his jaw dropping open in sheer horror. He weakly shook his head, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. He told his brother that everything was completely gone. His personal savings, his domestic credit lines, and his hidden offshore safety nets had all been instantly seized by the aggressive compliance algorithms. The parasitic brother who had smugly mocked my daughter just 30 minutes prior was now staring directly into the terrifying abyss of absolute financial ruin. They were both unequivocally bankrupt. Before either of them could fully process the absolute devastation of their ruined empire, a deep, resonant chime echoed loudly through the heavily fortified mansion. Someone had just pressed the button at the main front gate. The unexpected noise sliced through the tense silence like a physical blade. Derek jolted violently, his head snapping toward the large digital security monitor mounted securely on the wall near the archway. He stumbled across the room, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor, and aggressively slapped his palm against the control panel to wake the sleeping display. The high-definition security cameras instantly fed live video streams directly to the bright wall monitor, completely illuminating the terrifying reality waiting just outside the locked steel shutters. At the towering wrought-iron front gates of the sprawling suburban estate, a massive, heavily armed federal strike team was already moving into position. 24 federal agents wearing thick, dark tactical gear and heavy ballistic helmets were rapidly deploying from a fleet of unmarked black utility vehicles. The flashing red and blue emergency lights sliced violently through the freezing, snowy night, casting long, menacing shadows across the pristine front lawn. 2 heavily armored agents were already carrying a massive steel battering ram toward the primary entrance, fully preparing to breach the thick wooden doors with overwhelming force. Derek let out a choked, terrified whimper, his hands gripping the edges of the wall monitor as he watched his absolute worst nightmare unfold in stunning high definition. But the true horror was far from over. I knew that Mitchell Carter had not just alerted the federal government. He had also ensured that the violent syndicate operating out of the South Side received an anonymous tip that Derek was actively planning to flee the country with their stolen $40 million. Derek frantically swiped his trembling finger across the security panel, switching the primary video feed to the rear service entrance of the estate. The camera displayed the dark, narrow access road located behind the expansive property. 3 heavily tinted, unmarked black utility vehicles abruptly pulled up to the rear security gate, their headlights completely extinguished. The heavy doors of the dark vehicles swung open simultaneously. 6 tall, broad-shouldered men stepped out into the freezing night air. They were not wearing tactical federal gear or bright windbreakers. They were dressed in long, dark winter coats, moving with a cold, highly professional precision. They did not shout commands or wave flashlights. They simply drew heavy, suppressed firearms from inside their coats and began silently scaling the rear security wall. The cartel enforcers had arrived, and they were not interested in reading Derek his Miranda rights. The dual threat was real and devastating. Derek stared at the monitor, watching the agents preparing to breach the front doors, while the syndicate enforcers infiltrated his rear perimeter. His legs gave out. The alpha male facade he cultivated for his adult life shattered. He dropped to his knees, landing in the center of the ruined white Persian rug, directly in the middle of the crimson wine stain. He was no longer a corporate titan. He was a terrified coward facing the consequences of his actions. He began to hyperventilate, tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of his doom crushed his spirit. Derek scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees, grabbing the fabric of my black tuxedo trousers. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving with sobs. He begged me to override the smart home system. He pleaded with me to unlock the heavy steel shutters and provide an avenue of escape. He promised me everything, forgetting he possessed nothing. He cried out that the men at the rear gate were going to murder him. He begged me to transfer the funds to pay the syndicate to shield him from the violent predators he had climbed into bed with. He pleaded for his life, his voice a broken whine that echoed pitifully against the walls of his locked, gilded cage. I looked down at the man writhing at my feet. Derek Thorne, the supposedly brilliant financial mastermind of Chicago, was completely undone. His pathetic weeping filled the cavernous room, serving as a sharp contrast to the arrogant laughter that had echoed off these walls just an hour ago. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the fabric of my trousers, but I took a slow, deliberate step backward. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the trembling, broken coward, bleeding heavily into the pristine white Persian rug. I reached into my tuxedo jacket, pulling out the heavy leather dossier Mitchell had given me earlier that morning. I held it out over Derek, letting the silence stretch until his frantic sobbing reduced to a terrified whimper. I opened my hand, letting the thick stack of forged syndicate loan documents fall heavily onto his chest. He flinched, his tear-filled eyes darting from the scattered papers back up to my face. "You really thought I was just an obsolete old man, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You thought you could blind me with expensive scotch and hollow compliments. You thought my daughter was nothing more than a convenient disposable shield. But you made a fatal miscalculation. I built my entire logistics empire tearing apart men 10 times as smart as you. I survived in a brutal world where weakness is instantly punished, and you are by far the weakest, most pathetic man I have ever had the profound displeasure of meeting." Derek stared blindly at the forged signatures on the scattered documents, his breath catching painfully in his throat, as he finally understood the absolute inescapable scope of my total retaliation. He knew he was looking at his own undeniable death warrant. I did not wait for him to try and formulate another pathetic, desperate excuse. I turned my back on him and pulled out my mobile phone. I opened the smart home application, bypassed his encrypted security protocols, and selected the primary access controls. I did not unlock the heavy steel shutters covering the windows. I did not open the rear service gates where the cartel enforcers were currently scaling the stone walls. I simply pressed a single button to electronically release the heavy deadbolts on the main front doors of the sprawling mansion. The loud metallic clack of the complex locks disengaging echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. 3 seconds later, the massive wooden double doors were violently kicked open. The heavy boots of the federal strike team thundered across the marble foyer, their harsh voices shattering the remaining silence as they flooded into the house. Bright tactical flashlights swept aggressively across the previously darkened hallways, cutting violently through the shadows as they rapidly secured the expansive perimeter. They poured into the private living room in a coordinated, overwhelming wave of dark armor and drawn weapons. The commanding officer barked sharp, deafening orders, demanding that everyone immediately show their hands and drop to the floor. Trent was the absolute first to completely break. The arrogant parasite who had happily spent years feeding off my daughter's quiet misery let out a high-pitched, utterly terrified shriek as two heavily armored federal agents aggressively charged toward his leather armchair. He threw his trembling hands high into the air, completely surrendering before they even managed to reach him. The agents violently grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him to his feet and slamming him face first against the custom bookshelf. I watched with absolute cold satisfaction as a dark, spreading stain quickly formed on the front of his tailored trousers. He had completely soiled himself in pure terror. The agents forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs as he blubbered incoherently about his innocence. Simultaneously, 4 agents surrounded Derek on the ruined carpet. They did not show an ounce of hesitation or mercy. They aggressively grabbed the collar of his expensive tuxedo jacket and hauled him violently to his feet, slamming him roughly against the heavy stone fireplace. Derek shrieked loudly in pain as the cold, unforgiving steel cuffs bit deeply into his pale wrists. He thrashed weakly against their grip, desperately twisting his neck to look back at me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic horror. He screamed my name, begging me to tell the agents about the men waiting at the back gate. He knew perfectly well that the federal prison system would not ever protect him. He knew that the syndicate possessed the endless reach and the ruthless patience to find him even behind maximum security bars. He realized in that moment that I was not just sending him to a cramped cell. I was actively sending him to his inevitable bloody execution. His frantic screams echoed down the long hallway as the agents aggressively dragged his thrashing, pathetic body out of the mansion and into the freezing winter night. The chaotic, deafening storm of federal agents rapidly swarmed around us systematically, sweeping through the sprawling mansion to secure the remaining digital evidence and hidden physical servers. I completely ignored the aggressive shouting and the heavy tactical footsteps loudly echoing upstairs as agents cleared the remaining floors. I turned my attention entirely to my daughter. Natalie was still kneeling on the floor, her body trembling violently as she watched her tormentors being dragged away in chains. The heavy dose of medication Derek had forced upon her earlier was completely overwhelmed by the massive adrenaline spike of the raid. She looked up at me, her brown eyes wide, terrified, and utterly confused by the absolute devastation of the safe world she had confidently known just 20 minutes ago. I walked over to her, stepping carefully around the sharp, jagged shards of broken crystal and the dark, expanding pool of spilled red wine that permanently stained the expensive white rug. I knelt down closely beside her entirely, ignoring the dull, throbbing pain radiating in my own heavily bandaged hand, and gently wrapped my strong arms around her violently shaking shoulders. I pulled her tightly, warmly against my broad chest, physically shielding her from the harsh, flashing blue and bright red emergency lights, aggressively bleeding through the grand front foyer. I removed my heavy, warm wool overcoat and draped it securely over her thin, shivering frame. I held her close, pressing my chin against the top of her head, murmuring soft, comforting assurances that she was finally safe. She buried her face in my shoulder, her fragile composure completely shattering as she let out a long, ragged sob of profound relief. I helped her slowly, carefully to her feet, fully supporting her exhausted physical weight as we finally turned our backs on the ruined, tragic room forever. We walked together slowly through the chaotic, heavily crowded foyer, stepping bravely out the front door and directly into the biting, freezing cold air of the harsh Chicago winter. I guided her toward my waiting car, leaving the completely shattered, empty, and hollow remnants of Derek Thorne's fake empire burning quietly in the dark behind us. 6 months have passed since that bitter winter night when the heavy wooden doors of the sprawling suburban estate were kicked open by federal agents. The passage of time has a remarkable way of washing away the lingering stench of deception and fear. The massive financial empire that Derek Thorne built on a foundation of cruel lies and stolen capital has been completely dismantled. It was systematically torn apart piece by piece until absolutely nothing remained but a mountain of federal indictments and public humiliation. The justice system moves slowly, but it moves with an inescapable and crushing weight when handed an airtight case. Derek is currently serving a 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He was convicted on dozens of counts of massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, and severe identity theft. The arrogant, charismatic smile he once used to charm wealthy investors and intimidate his terrified wife has been permanently erased. He now lives in a tiny concrete cell entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his false sense of superiority. He knows that he will spend the rest of his natural life looking over his shoulder because the federal prison system offers no real sanctuary from the dangerous syndicate men he stole from. Trent did not fare much better. The cowardly parasite who happily spent years mocking my daughter immediately folded during his very first federal interrogation. He wept openly in the holding room and desperately took a heavily restricted plea deal. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a medium security facility completely devoid of the luxury and privilege he felt so intensely entitled to. He will spend a decade scrubbing cafeteria trays and regretting the moment he ever decided to speak down to my child. The $40 million in illicit syndicate debt that Derek had cruelly attempted to pin on my daughter was swiftly and decisively handled by the federal authorities. Mitchell Carter and his elite team of forensic accountants provided the government task force with an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable digital evidence. The detailed server logs unequivocally proved that Derek had systematically forged the signature of Natalie on every single piece of fraudulent paperwork. The federal investigators officially cleared her name of any and all corporate wrongdoing. They seized the remaining hidden offshore funds and systematically intercepted the massive criminal cash flow before the violent cartel enforcers could ever attempt to collect on their devastating losses. The highly dangerous Eastern European syndicate realized that their entire financial laundering operation in Chicago had been utterly compromised by the massive federal raid. Facing intense government scrutiny and crippling financial seizures, they immediately retreated into the dark shadows, abandoning their pursuit of the stolen funds to focus entirely on basic survival. My daughter was safely and permanently removed from their lethal crosshairs. She was finally completely free from the suffocating nightmare that had consumed her life for the past 3 years. The physical and emotional healing process for Natalie was not an overnight miracle. The deep psychological scars inflicted by a manipulative abuser take a considerable amount of time and dedicated professional therapy to properly heal. The first few weeks after the dramatic rescue were incredibly challenging for her. She had to slowly unlearn the pervasive fear that had been systematically drilled into her mind. She had to stop constantly apologizing for merely existing and gradually relearn how to walk into a room without bracing for an impending physical impact. But as the dark winter months slowly melted into a bright and beautiful Chicago spring, I watched a profound and magnificent transformation unfold. The heavy, thick layers of cosmetic foundation she used to hide her terrible bruises were permanently discarded. The vibrant, healthy color gradually returned to her pale cheeks, and the bright, genuine light finally returned to her beautiful brown eyes. She began to actively reclaim the remarkable, fierce, and resilient spirit that she had always possessed deep inside. The state champion gymnast who had once dominated the balance beam with absolute fearless confidence slowly began to reemerge from the heavy shadows of her broken marriage. I wanted to ensure that her newfound strength and independence were channeled into something truly meaningful and enduring. During my long and arduous career building a commercial logistics empire, I had established a substantial charitable foundation designed to help vulnerable communities throughout the greater Chicago area. The foundation provided critical funding for domestic abuse shelters, comprehensive legal aid clinics, and extensive vocational training programs for women escaping dangerous living situations. Upon my retirement, I had installed a board of directors to manage the daily operations, but I always retained absolute executive control. I decided it was the perfect time to pass the torch to someone who truly understood the profound importance of our mission. I offered Natalie the prestigious position of primary executive director. She did not hesitate to accept the tremendous responsibility. She poured her entire soul into the demanding work, utilizing her remarkable intelligence and deep personal empathy to fiercely advocate for women who were trapped in the exact same silent terror she had so recently escaped. She transformed her painful traumatic experiences into a powerful weapon for positive systemic change. Watching her command a boardroom with absolute unyielding authority is the proudest achievement of my entire life. This late summer evening, I am sitting quietly on the wide wooden porch of my secluded estate, watching the vibrant orange and deep purple sunset slowly fade into the calm Chicago horizon. A gentle warm breeze rustles softly through the tall ancient oak trees surrounding the quiet property. I hold a heavy crystal glass filled with vintage scotch, allowing the smooth-aged liquor to warm my chest. The golden amber liquid catches the fading sunlight, perfectly reflecting the quiet triumph that now defines our peaceful daily existence. It is a quiet luxury that feels entirely different from the toxic, suffocating opulence we purposefully left behind in the dark, crumbling, isolated ruins of his completely shattered and permanently destroyed world. From my comfortable vantage point, I can clearly see Natalie sitting down near the blooming garden. She is laughing brightly while talking on her mobile phone to one of her foundation colleagues. There is a profound, radiant joy in her voice that fills the evening air with pure, absolute peace. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling a deep sense of total completion. The dark storm has finally passed, leaving behind a beautiful, pristine calm. I look at my strong, resilient daughter, and I know with absolute certainty that I would destroy 1,000 empires to keep her safe. The ruthless, calculating monster I had to become to orchestrate the total financial slaughter of Derek Thorne is now resting quietly back in the shadows. But he is never completely gone. He remains a silent, invisible guardian standing firmly at the gates, forever ready to strike if anyone ever dares to threaten my family again. The war was brutal, devastating, and completely terrifying, but the ultimate victory is undeniably sweet. We survived the bitter cold, and we have finally walked out into the warm, beautiful light of a brand new dawn together. True power does not need to scream brag or wear expensive suits to prove it exists. When you build your life on deception, exploiting the kindness of family and the vulnerability of those you are supposed to protect, you are building a castle on a fault line. Never mistake the silence of a father for ignorance, and never underestimate the lengths a parent will go to shield their child. The most dangerous men in the room are never the ones throwing punches. They are the ones quietly observing, gathering ammunition, and waiting for the perfect moment to burn your world. Have you ever had to step in and fiercely protect a loved one from a toxic relationship? Share your own survival stories in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice, revenge, and unbreakable family bonds.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step leads me home. He taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.